Hi, I'm Paul Marcel. I wanted to go over my drum sander a bit today simply because recently I was using it to flatten some stock and sand some stock in preparation for making drawers for the vanity that I'm making right now. And I realized that there's a lot of little tricks that you pick up along the way when you're using a drum sander that I thought I would pass along. So if you already have a drum sander, hopefully some of these will be useful to you. Now, I said that I was using this recently to flatten stock for drawers. I do tend to use it for drawer parts because they're small. They tend to want to go through a planer very easily. And also, they seem to do better because of the way that this is so flat. You'll get very, very flat stock coming out of it, whereas you can still have a little bit of issues with the planer simply because this is so small. You're going to get snipe problems and all that. Yay, drum sanders don't suffer from snipe. Now what I did for those vanity drawers is I simply took some maple stock and I resawed it in half. I mean, I didn't even bother flattening it or doing anything on the outside, so we still have a rough edge over here on this side, and the other side's even worse. So we're going to go ahead and run this thing through the drum sander, and I'll show you a couple tricks along the way of how it works, and then maybe even show you a couple of mistakes so you can see what it does when something goes wrong. One other great use of the drum sander is to flatten some unusual stock. Now this is a small piece of walnut that I have. It's got some crazy grain back over here. Now I happen to have taken care of this with hand planes, but had I not done that and it just came off of the bandsaw, there was actually a lot of waves in here and it needed some work. So it would have been very easy for me to put it on, say, just a piece of melamine to act as a platen. You screw on a small board on the back to act somewhat like a bench hook just for keeping that board from being able to be pushed off, because remember the sander is going to be sanding into it against its motion. And then you could flatten it that way. Now of course the problem that I have here is that this board here, it's not laying flat at all. So that's where you can grab yourself a couple shims. You know, we can put one under here to pop this thing up. Then I need one over here in this corner. Now that's holding steady. Now of course the shims are going to want to move. It's being vibrated through the sander. So just take a little bit of hot melt glue, pop a little underneath those shims when you push them under. Then at least when you put the board here, you're going to be fine. You can run it through until you get this side nice and flat, flip and repeat. Just put a couple strips of turner's tape on here, and then take, say this was too small. It actually isn't, but say it was. I would just stick that on there, and now I run it through. But the magic of this little platen doesn't stop there. With this hook here, it turns out that I can add a very nice outfeed table by using this, by placing this upside down on my table saw. So as it sits on the top deck of the table saw, this prevents it from sliding any further. It turns out that with this 3/4 inch piece of melamine and the height of this and my saw stop, I can actually put this right in front of my saw stop, and this is the perfect height, almost exactly the same height as this back piece here. So I use it as an extended outfeed table that I can set up in literally seconds. Earlier, I had a neighbor and she was getting rid of her drum sanding and all of her woodworking tools, so I grabbed the Performax sander from her since it was in perfect working condition except the fact that the electrical switch had gone out, and that's a trivial 10-minute job to fix. Now, here's an interesting thing. If you ever go to Knott's Berry Farm in California and you see those little wood ducks that have a wooden handle, it turns out she was the one that originally proposed that idea to Knott's Berry Farm and then got the contract and had been making them for something like 12 years before she just couldn't keep up. So then it eventually got shipped overseas to China. But previously, my neighbor was actually the one that had provided those for 12 years. Who knew? Now the papers that you get that are already pre-cut and ready to wrap on your drum, they're going to start with a taper on one side, and then they're going to go all the way through straight, and then they're going to end with the taper on the other end. But you can see that the tapers align themselves when you're done, and you have it in just basically a belt form. So this is on a pre-rolled one. Now you can also get this paper for bulk, and you can actually get a great deal on that if you go to buy, especially if you're going to be sticking with a single grit for most of your work. Like for me, 60 and 80 would take care of the vast majority of my drum sanding work. Now when you get that, you're going to get a long roll. It's handy if you know the length of the roll that you have for yours. So if you don't have any papers with yours, get yourself some pre-wrap to make sure that you have the exact right length for it first. It turns out that for this sander, it's an 80-inch belt that you're going to end up needing, or 80-inch strip. So you can go and order it in bulk, but the reason why you want to know the length is you want to take the length of those bulk rolls and divide them out to figure out how many rolls you're going to get. If a certain roll is going to give you 7.9 belts, then you're almost paying for a whole loop. That's useless because it's going to be too short. So use that to help choose the right bulk belt length in order to get the maximized number of belts out of it without any loss. Now that said, you got to know how to cut it, and that's why I brought all this up. Because when I got that sander from my neighbor lady, she had purchased a long belt of 60, and she decided, I'm just going to take care of cutting all that up today, get it out of the way. So she did that. And what she did is that she had the belt, you know, the bulk belt, and then she took this one and then she laid it on the top, and then she cut it. And you can probably see what went wrong right there. She put it grit to grit. What you need to do is, if you're going to put this one grit up, you need to put this one grit up. In her case, she ended up getting the tapers exactly backwards. So because of that, she couldn't use any of the belts that she cut. So now, of the grits that you can get, which ones are you going to use the most? It turns out that there's a variety pack that you can get from Jet, and it's going to come with some 36 grits. You're going to get a strip of 36, 2 of 80, and then 1 of 120. It turns out that for this kit, I would use all of them except the 36. Now, originally, I had a large project and I needed to do a lot of flattening. So I thought, well, 36 grit, that's going to go faster than 60 grit, no problem. So I tried that out, and what I found, and I talked to Mark Spagnolo and asked his opinion to see if he's finding the same thing, and basically we both came to the same conclusion. 36 grit basically just sits around and dents your project is all it does. Now, it's probably going to work okay on some really hard woods, because those are going to be able to stay up there and then have the grit be able to cut. But overall, the grit on this 36 grit is so big, it basically in my case it was Sapele, it was just making dented tracks through it. It was never really cutting much. So I found that I switched to 60 grit and it was going amazingly faster compared to 36. So I'd say if you're going to get a combination box, try the 36 on just some very hard woods, but don't use it on anything softer. You're just going to find that you're going to make a mess of your project and have to do a little bit of work. So which are the best grits for doing some of your work? Now, in here right now, I have 60 grit because I'm planning on flattening some of these drawer parts in order to do a demo. Now, I wouldn't want to start with 80 grit when I've got this much work to do, but as I said, the 36 grit is less than useful. Now, going up through to about a 120. 120 is about the most that I'll go, simply because the grit gets to be so fine and so closed on the paper that you're having a hard time evacuating the heat. Now, again, if you're in a colder climate or it's colder out, you may be able to get away with that because you're going to have the atmosphere helping cool it besides just the airflow. But for me, in Arizona, it's always kind of hot here. I have to be careful about that. And really, when it gets above 120, it's very, very easy for me to burn paper. Now, if you have a glued up panel that you're going to be running through your sander, again, with this thing being a 1632, I can run it through this way here first, and then I could rotate it around this way to get the other side done. One of the things I'd like to caution you on is that if you're running a panel through, make sure that you take all the glue squeeze out off. Now, of course, if you're running it through a planer, there's no reason to. Just toss that right on in. It's going to be taking off the material on the top. It won't even notice that glue squeeze out that's there. So you can save yourself some time. But one of the problems is that, remember that this paper generates a fair amount of heat. And a lot of the PVA glues, especially if they haven't been set for a long time, they're going to melt when they go underneath that heat. Now what's going to happen to you is that you're going to get a sheet like this. This was actually a sheet that I was given with my older sander from my neighbor, and I often wondered what the heck happened to it. I never had any idea, so I kept it just because I was kind of curious. And then the first time I ran a panel through that had a little bit of glue squeeze out, I noticed some of these same black streaks coming out on the paper. Now those black streaks are actually going to transfer to your material as well. So as it's going through and it's burning onto the paper, it's going to continue leaving this black streak on your wood. And a lot of times what it is it's either a pitch patch or it was a little bit of glue squeeze out. So make sure that you avoid that, because once it gets on the paper, you've pretty much ruined your roll. Now, if you did want to get some glue out, I took it off the sander and then I tucked it away into the freezer. So it gets that glue really, really hard. And then what it was very easy to just roll this out, and then you could just take a putty knife and just run it kind of vertically to kind of scrape it, and it would flick most of it off. Now, you do have to make sure you get all of it off, because if any of it's there, it's going to melt and make a streak again. Now, speaking of the heat buildup, remember that if you're going to put a brand new belt on there, you're going to want to wrap it onto the drum. You're going to get it as tight as you can. But honestly, when you run a board through, after one run, or maybe 2 passes, go ahead and stop the sander and take a look, because the heat is going to make these belts stretch a little bit at first, and you're going to want to pick up the slack. Otherwise, some of the wraps that are next to each other are going to overlap. And once you get that, you're going to get an extra dent in your wood there. And possibly it's even going to do a little bit of damage to the edge of the paper. So you're going to want to watch that. Now, one of the actions of this sander is that the sanding is done purely linearly. As this board is conveying through the machine, this roll is rolling and the paper is only acting, sanding, along the length of the board as it goes through. Now that's going to be with the grain if you run it through this way, but if, you can run it through sideways as well, and you can get it to go diagonal. And I'll talk about that in a little bit too. So one of the things that you're going to notice is that the grit lines are actually pretty pronounced. Now this one here came out of 60 grit. That's on here, and I can definitely, even though I'm looking at the camera, I can move my hands here and I can definitely feel the grit lines on there. Now if I use, say, 60 grit in a random orbit, I wouldn't feel it anywhere near as pronounced because they wouldn't be ridges, they would be little circles, so it tends to be a little bit more flat sensation. So what you're going to notice is that whatever grit you end on with the drum sander, you're going to want to start with that grit with your random orbit sander to pick up from there in order to basically turn those linear marks into the random orbit marks before you continue up through the grits to your final grit. Now I was talking about the linear sanding marks that happen on the boards as they go through this drum sander. One of the things that you're going to notice is if you're doing this sanding is that if you keep passing it linearly, you're going to be taking off some material and taking off some material, but it doesn't go anywhere near as quickly as if you go and you run it through just at a slight skew, and then on your next pass, run it on a skew the other direction. The reason being is that you're forming, if you're running it through linearly, you're going to be forming these rigid lines that go vertically down the board. So there's these ridges. Now if you run it a second time, those ridges kind of prevent the grit from getting any deeper as they have to sort of work those ridges. So you're spending time kind of going over the same ridges and you don't get to go as quickly. If you're going diagonally across the previous ridges, you're going to find that you're going in a way perpendicular to those ridges and you're simply going to be sanding them right off. And you'll notice a marked difference in speed if you do that. So run them through at a slight skew in one direction and then run it through on a slight skew the other direction. Now one thing I recommend is if you are going through several grits, say from 60 to 80 and maybe up to 120, is go ahead and do the skewing like I'm talking about for getting your sanding done quickly at a particular grit. When you're at the last pass with that grit, run it through straight. So what you want is that when it comes off the sander, you want it to have linear lines of the scratches for that particular grit. And the reason why is now if this was 60 and I just ran this through at 60 and I move up to 80, now if I'm doing these skewed cuts and it comes out and I can still see scratch lines going straight down the board, I know those scratch lines are actually still from the 60 grit. So I still have to go further with the 80 to get rid of that 60. Until I have only the diagonal lines from my 80 grit, I know I still have more work to do. So then at the end of the 80, run it through straight, go to the 120, do it on the different angles until you get it to come out with no straight vertical ones, and then run it through straight. So when you connect the DC hose, one of the biggest problems is it wants to do that, and it does it quite often while you're running. Even if you make sure that latch is on, just the vibration, you doing things, it's going to do that once, you're going to get dust all over your face, and it's going to possibly burn your stock. So an alternative is, of course, let's put it on this side of the sander. Well, then you're on top of your speed control and you're in the way of your adjustment knob, so it just becomes a nuisance. At least from this side, though, it's not going to flip on you, so that's pretty good. So what I did is I put this little board on here. It just has a groove along the side so that it can kind of clip into here. I just have one screw that goes into the base. It was already a pre-existing hole that was down there, and that just holds up onto the side. I put a simple clip for a dust collection hose at the top. Put it there, and I never have this problem again. So when I go to adjust the height for the board, typically what I'll do for the very first board is you get it just kind of close so that you can slide the board underneath. And then after that, you're going to want to do it with a running board. So you're going to run the conveyor and you're going to run the drum sander. And what you're going to do is just keep on sliding the board in and out until you eventually start to feel the drum head just engage the wood. And at that time, let it go through. And you'll get a good idea. If you want to lower it while the board is going through, you can. Or if you want to raise it because it seems like it's too aggressive of a cut. That first pass is how you're going to set the height for starting all of your work. So that initial board you'll want to run back through again just to get it equal to what the others are going to be after their first pass. So what I want to do now is I'm going to set a fairly aggressive cut. I'm going to get it about halfway through this board, and that would be about the time that it would want to pop a breaker when the motor's running it really hard. And then I'm going to unplug this unit. So I'm going to simulate power failure on that, and we're going to see what's going to happen to it. Now I'm going to do it on this same sides that I was running on, simply because I got a fair ways to go before I get rid of this junk over here, and I don't really want to ruin a kind of nice side on this side. Now it's hard to see on this board simply because it didn't actually burn as much as I expected. Usually we'll get a fairly distinct burn mark here, but it depends on how heavily loaded this was. Had I been doing a lot of sanding, the paper would generally be warmer and you would get a pretty distinct burn mark here. It is discolored, but one thing that you would notice is if you looked on the side, you can see that it's all nice and flat because it was going through the sander, and then here you'll actually get a little bit of a dig where that happened. When you get a power failure like that because you're taking off too much, I mean, if you're getting near the final size of your boards, you're going to probably have to go through all of your stock then to get it back to a consistent size to get rid of that little ding that you put in there. Now when I upgraded this unit to the SandSmart, the reason for doing that was the controller itself is a lot more intelligent. What it does is it monitors the current draw of the large sanding motor and it throttles back on the small conveyor motor. So in a way you're going to set this to a particular speed. I mean, the speeds go from 0 to 100. So let's say you set this to 80 and you're trying to take off too much, or the panel is too wide for the speed you're going at, whatever. It's going to notice that this motor is getting close to its ampere limit, and what it's going to do is it's going to slow the conveyor down so that the sanding head can keep up with the rate that the stock is being fed. Now, of course, you might be running something through and have this so low that there's just no chance. But if it's close, this is going to work very, very well at backing it off. A benefit of the SandSmart controller is after you've done your initial pass through, crank this all the way up to 100, because it's going to throttle back to the fastest speed that you can go with that board without popping a breaker. So it's the fastest speed that you could use, period. And when you're doing drum sanding, speed is an issue because it's really slow. Is it just me, or do all of us with a radio-controlled remote pointed at what we're turning off? Sorry.